The Keth-Tavrosi had a word for what we were doing. I never learned to pronounce it correctly. Their consonants required a secondary larynx I did not have. But one of their junior liaison officers, a young male named Sevorath, was kind enough to translate it for me on the third morning of the joint exercise, while we were standing in an equipment bay waiting for a calibration sweep to finish. It meant, roughly, the noise animals make before they die. He said it without malice. That was the part I kept coming back to later. He genuinely thought he was being helpful. He had heard it used among his colleagues and wanted to make sure I understood the context, because he was the kind of young officer who felt that transparency was a professional virtue, and who had not yet lived long enough to understand that transparency and tact are not always pointing in the same direction. I thanked him and went back to my boards. My name is Chief Warrant Officer Dara Oshino, and I ran signals coordination for the 14th Combined Arms Group during the Tavar Reach exercises of '87. My job, at its most stripped down, was to make sure that every unit in a dispersed multi-ship, multi-ground formation could talk to every other unit without the enemy understanding what was being said, or, more importantly, who was saying it, where they were saying it from, and what they were about to do next. I had done this job for 19 years across 4 wars, 1 police action, a stabilization mission that everyone involved had agreed was a war once it was over, and now a joint training exercise with the Keth-Tavrosi Defense Collective, which was the first time a human military formation had operated alongside theirs in a live-fire environment. The exercise was described, in the official mission brief, as a confidence-building measure. That was the diplomatic language. In practice, it meant that we were supposed to perform well enough that the Keth-Tavrosi would feel comfortable standing next to us in an actual engagement, which required them to believe we were something other than what they currently believed us to be. What they currently believed us to be, based on the intelligence assessment their signals directorate had prepared, and which a helpful Keth-Tavrosi administrative officer had accidentally included in the wrong shared document package, was a pre-technological species that had acquired FTL drive capability through a Dothraki trade arrangement before we fully understood what to do with it, and were now operating above our actual capability level through a combination of instinct, aggression, and the kind of fortunate improvisation that could not be reliably reproduced at scale. It was, to be fair, not the least accurate intelligence assessment I had ever read. They had simply started from the wrong frame and built a coherent structure on it, which is the most durable kind of wrong. The Keth-Tavrosi were, by any reasonable military measure, exceptional. They stood 2.5 meters on average, proportioned like someone had taken a human blueprint and redistributed the mass with a strong preference for the upper body, wide through the shoulders, deep in the chest, 4 arms rather than 2, the upper pair longer and more powerful, the lower pair shorter and used primarily for fine manipulation. Their skin ran through shades of deep amber and burnished copper, and it had a slight iridescence in direct light that I learned not to stare at on the first day, because sustained direct eye contact combined with attention to the iridescence was considered a territorial display, and I did not need any additional complications. Their eyes were 4 in number, arranged in a horizontal band across the upper portion of the face, giving them nearly 300 degrees of passive visual coverage without any head movement. Their hearing range overlapped with ours significantly at the lower end, but extended further at the high end. Their sense of smell was vestigial, and they had been mildly contemptuous of species that relied on it heavily since approximately the same era when humans were debating whether the Earth was flat, which gave you some sense of where they were positioned on the arc of civilizational confidence. They moved with the unhurried precision of something that had never, in its evolutionary history, needed to hurry. Even the young ones, even Sevorath, who was barely adult by Keth-Tavrosi reckoning, and still carried the slightly oversized quality of a person who had recently grown faster than their coordination, had adjusted for, moved with a considered economy that made most human soldiers look like they were operating in fast forward. Their military was accordingly excellent, formally codified doctrine going back 11 centuries, a signals architecture that was a layered, frequency-hopping, quantum-keyed system, their own intelligence branch openly described as having never been successfully intercepted in 300 years of continuous operational development. A command and control structure running 14 levels of redundancy. Every element of their military thinking had been refined across millennia of interspecies conflict, cataloged, analyzed, iterated upon, and encoded into doctrine with the institutional rigor of a civilization that had been taking its own defense seriously since before humans had iron. They had files on 72 species, tactical profiles for 31 known weapons platforms, communication intercept libraries covering 40 languages across 9 distinct signal modalities. Their intelligence directorate's collection methodology was, by the assessment of our own analysts, probably the most systematic in the known volume of explored space. They did not have a useful file on us. What they had was a collection of intercepts from our engagements with the Vreth Combine and the Halun Sovereignty, some secondary source analysis from the Dorvaki trade missions, and a great deal of inference from behavioral observation. The inference had produced conclusions. The conclusions, as laid out in the assessment I had not been meant to read, were not flattering. Primitive drive acquisition, the file said. Compensatory aggression in place of doctrinal depth. Herd coordination instinct sublimated into quasi-military hierarchy that lacks strategic abstraction capability. Communication architecture dependent on standard M signal modalities with minimal innovation since initial technology adoption. Recommend observation posture. Species is not currently adversarial, but trajectory is uncertain. Note, signal intercept profile consistent with predoctrinal species. I read this assessment on the first morning, sitting in the Keth-Tavrosi Forward Operating Bases Coordination Center, drinking what passed for coffee among the Keth-Tavrosi, a dark, bitter liquid produced from something that grew on a cold moon near their home system, and tasted like burned cedar, and something else I never identified but which did useful things to my alertness centers regardless of what my taste buds thought about it. Your analysts wrote that we lack the neurological substrate for strategic abstraction, I said to Sevoreth, who had been assigned as my liaison and was standing nearby trying to determine whether I was upset. The assessment was compiled before first contact protocols were established, he said. It is not current doctrine, but it has not been rescinded. He considered this carefully. No, he said. Good to know, I said, and poured myself a second cup of his terrible coffee. The Keth-Tavrosi coordinator I was most directly paired with was a signals officer named Velthrasa. She was senior to me by rank and by roughly 40 years of operational experience, and she had the economy of motion and the specific quality of contained capability that I associated with people who had been very good at something for a very long time. She had run signals coordination for 9 live engagements across 3 distinct theaters. Her intercept record was cited in 3 separate Keth-Tavrosi doctrinal publications as an example of best practice. She had developed, or co-developed, 2 of the signal analysis methodologies that were now standard across the Defense Collective's intelligence apparatus. She was, in short, the best signals officer I had worked alongside in 19 years, and on the first morning she looked at my equipment and made a professional assessment that she was too courteous to state aloud. My equipment was, to be honest, not impressive on the surface. The portable signals suite was 2 generations old. We'd requested an upgrade 3 times and been told the funding cycle didn't support it. The frequency management rack had been patched twice with field repairs, and had a known intermittent fault in the third channel selector that Corporal Bikel had addressed by wedging a folded piece of cardboard behind the card housing, which resolved the fault reliably, but did not look like the work of a well-funded military organization. One of the 3 relay nodes was mounted to the equipment frame with zip ties, because the original mounting brackets had stripped in the previous deployment, and the replacement parts were still on a requisition somewhere in the logistics pipeline. Velthros's eyes moved across this equipment with the 4-point convergence that I was learning meant focused assessment. She said nothing. She was too professional, but I saw what moved across her face, and it was not confidence in what she was seeing, and it was very slightly the same expression Sevoreth would have when he translated the phrase about the noise animals make before they die. "Chief Oshino," she said. Her translator rendered her voice into a precise, slightly formal English, the kind produced by a high-quality algorithm that had been trained on diplomatic and military registers. "I have reviewed your formation's signals architecture summary." "Yes," I said. "Your declared signal plan is standard, primary frequency hop protocol, 2 fallback channels, standard authentication architecture. However," she paused, "my preliminary analysis of your formation's intercept record from previous operations shows coordination events that do not correspond to any of these channels. There are gaps in the correlation, significant ones." She said it as a courtesy. She was giving me the opportunity to explain what she had clearly assumed was an administrative discrepancy, a mismatch between the declared architecture and the actual one, which would mean either sloppy record-keeping or something more concerning. A gap in the signal record meant a gap in the coordination method, and a gap in the coordination method meant units that couldn't reliably communicate. And units that couldn't reliably communicate had a well-documented tendency to end up in situations that generated paperwork nobody wanted to write. "I know," I said. She waited. "The gaps are intentional," I said. She studied me with all 4 eyes for a moment. It was not an aggressive look. It was the look of someone running a very fast internal calculation. "You maintain intentional gaps in your signals architecture," she said, "and your units still coordinate." "They do." "With what?" "I'll show you when it comes up," I said. She held the 4-point regard for another 2 seconds, then said, "I see," in the tone of someone who did not yet see but who had decided to proceed on available information. She returned to the briefing material, and I went back to my coffee, and we began the exercise the following morning. The exercise itself was a distributed force interdiction scenario. 2 opposing formations, blue and red, operating across a volume of space roughly twice the diameter of a habitable system, with a contested ground element on the 3rd moon of a gas giant the Kethtav-Rossi called Havrith Kelm. The moon had a thin but breathable atmosphere, a temperature range that required cold weather gear but not suits, and a terrain profile of rolling basalt plains punctuated by deep canyon systems that played havoc with line-of-sight communications and provided excellent cover for a ground element that wanted to approach relay installations without being observed. There were 5 relay installations on the equatorial belt. Blue's objective was to hold at least 3 of them at exercise end. Red's objective was to neutralize at least 3. Blue was us, the 14th Combined Arms Group, 4 ships, 2 ground battalions, and my signals section of 12 people. Red was a Kethtav-Rossi training formation, approximately 2/3 of their 3rd Expeditionary Cadre, commanded by a senior fleet claw named Dash Varathi, whose 40-year operational record included 11 wins in this specific scenario against formations of comparable size and considerably more institutional credibility than ours. The French formation he'd last run against 7th Rapid Response, which I knew by reputation as a solid, experienced unit, had lasted 41 minutes before Blue Command declared a route compromise. We had 4 days. The first day was orientation, coordination briefings, and what the exercise framework called mutual capability disclosure, each side explaining its doctrine and systems to the other, in enough detail to allow coordinated operation, and in not quite enough detail to compromise operational security. I sat through 6 hours of Keth-Tavrossi doctrine briefings, and watched my people take notes with the slightly careful attention of soldiers who have been told something is a training exercise, and are not entirely sure they believe it. The Keth-Tavrossi briefers were thorough. They explained their command structure, their standard signal architecture, their ground coordination doctrine, their ship-to-ground communication protocols, the precise frequency bands they were operating on, and the authentication handshake methodology and the fallback procedures. They explained all of this in the slightly slow, slightly simplified register of professionals who are accustomed to briefing allies who they expect to have trouble keeping up. My counterpart delivered the human side of the disclosure. She explained our declared architecture, our primary and fallback channels, our ground coordination protocols. Everything she said was accurate. Everything she said was also, from my perspective, a description of approximately 60% of what we were actually doing. On the evening of day 1, Velthrossa ran a calibration sweep of the combined formation's signal environment. Standard procedure. She was mapping the active frequencies to avoid cross-interference. She ran it personally, which told me something about how seriously she was taking the exercise even this early. Her sweep found our declared channels operating exactly as described. It also found additional traffic she could not characterize. It was clearly intentional. The pattern was too consistent for random noise, but it did not correspond to any signal modality in her reference library, and her reference library was comprehensive enough that "not in it" was not a category she encountered frequently. She filed a query. The query went to Dashvarathi. He read it and sent for Sevorath. I know what was said in that meeting, because Sevorath described it to me afterward, over the same terrible cedar coffee, with the candor of a young officer who has processed something surprising and wants to make sure he has the story straight. Dashvarathi had been unhurried about it. He had read the query, read it again, and said, "Velthrossa cannot characterize the additional traffic." "No, Senior Fleetclaw. She is certain it is intentional signal production." "She is. But it does not match any known human signal modality." "Correct." He had looked at the query for a third time. "Then either their signal architecture is more sophisticated than our intelligence assessment suggests," he said, "or it is considerably less sophisticated. File it. We will know more when the exercise runs." He was, as a commander, methodical. He did not reach for explanations before he had more data. That quality was admirable and would, over the next 3 days, become extremely relevant. Day 2 opened with a simulated ground advance. Both ground battalions moving on Installation 7, the closest of the 5 relay points, while the ship element maintained positioning in the contested space volume above. I was in a shallow equipment pit behind the 2nd Battalion's advance element, with Corporal Bikel and 3 other signals specialists, watching the coordination traffic flow across my boards and drinking coffee from a thermos, because the Keth-Tavrossi base's supply of their version had not yet caught up with the exercise deployment. Sevorath arrived at my elbow at 8:40 with a tablet and the expression of someone transmitting a question he found slightly awkward. "Senior Fleetclaw Dashvarathi requests a clarification," he said, "regarding the uncharacterized signal traffic identified in last night's sweep." "Sure," I said. "He asks, what is it?" I looked at the tablet. I looked at Sevorath. Behind him, the signal board was showing the movement data from the advance element, and if you listened carefully over the background noise of the equipment fans and the tactical radio traffic, you could hear it faint but present, carrying across the audio channels the way background sound always does, a low rhythmic production that was somewhere between a work chant and something considerably older. "It's the songs," I said. Sevorath stared at me with the contained but visible expression of someone who has not received the answer they anticipated. "The songs," he said. "The singing," I said. "Vocal coordination. Our units sing to each other during operations." A pause that had some length to it. "They sing," Sevorath said. "They do." "During the exercise." "During all operations," I said. "The exercise is not an exception." He looked at the boards. He looked at the advance elements position markers. He looked at me. On the signal display, 2nd Battalion was crossing a simulated river obstacle in good order, and the singing was there if you knew to listen for it. A low, rhythmic, layered sound that carried in the audio of the radio traffic like something completely unremarkable. "That is the uncharacterized traffic," he said slowly. "It is human vocal production." "Some of it," I said. "Some of it," he repeated. "The rest is instrumental, percussion mainly. One of Sergeant Alabi's people plays a small drum, traditional frame drum, his grandfather's. He's carried it through 4 deployments. Some units use improvised percussion, whatever they have available. The instrumentation varies, but the encoding key is consistent." Sevorath was quiet for longer than his usual processing time. "Chief Oceano," he said finally, with the particular care of a young officer who is not certain whether he is hearing something operationally significant or an extended joke at his expense. "Your units are coordinating a military advance using music." "Among other methods, yes." "As a deliberate signal protocol." "As a deliberate signal protocol." "And this is established practice in human military operations." "It is in mine," I said. "Different chiefs do it differently. This is my system. I've been running it for 12 years. He looked at the advance elements markers again. 2nd Battalion was consolidating on the far side of the obstacle in good order, and the singing had shifted as they consolidated. The rhythm changed. The texture changed. The tempo adjusted in a way that carried meaning to the people in the formation, and was entirely indistinguishable from background sound to anyone who didn't have the key. "I will relay this to Senior Fleetclaw Doshvarathi," Sevorath said, in the measured tone of someone who has not yet decided how to categorize what he is relaying. I went back to my boards. The relay came back at mid-afternoon, and this time Sevorath brought it with a slightly different expression. The particular look, which I was starting to recognize, that meant he had shared something with his colleagues and his colleagues had found it entertaining. The Senior Fleetclaw asks, "Is this a cultural practice, a morale measure of some kind?" "No," I said. "What is its function?" I put down the coffee and turned to face him. We had about 20 minutes before the next coordination event, and I could afford the attention. "It is a signal protocol," I said. "A complete parallel coordination architecture running on acoustic transmission. Key structure carries positional and directional data, which units, what bearing, at what distance from reference points. Tempo carries movement rate and execution timing. Harmonic structure, the layered relationships between different vocal lines, carries formation state, integrity reporting, casualty indicators. Rhythm pattern carries threat vector. Fast syncopation means active contact. Slow pulse means hold position. Specific beat patterns map to the standard tactical states. Improvised, melodic variation in the lead line carries commander's intent, the kind of discretionary information that a standard signal architecture would have to encode as a formatted message." Sevorath was listening with the focused attention he used when he was writing things down in his head rather than on a tablet. "The whole system runs on top of the declared channels as a parallel layer," I said. "It transmits over audio rather than M signal. It rides in the ambient sound of the radio traffic, in the background noise of the channel, in the general acoustic environment of a formation that has human beings in it. It cannot be jammed with standard electronic warfare equipment because there is nothing electronic about it. It cannot be intercepted by a signals analysis system because it doesn't appear on the spectrum. It can be heard if you're listening on the right frequencies, but it presents as ambient sound, as background noise, because that is what it sounds like to any analysis methodology that doesn't have the encoding key. I paused. The encoding key, I said, is not a document, it is a shared musical tradition. The soldiers in my formation don't decode the coordination signals consciously. They produce them and read them the way any human being reads music they know well, automatically, below the level of deliberate attention, in the part of the brain that processes pattern and sound. The tactical encoding is layered into musical structures that human beings have been using for coordination purposes for approximately 10,000 years. Drum communication in military formations, call and response in labor coordination, march tempo as a unit cohesion mechanism, regimental music as a command broadcast system. We have been doing this so long that it is in the muscle memory. The soldiers don't think about it. They just work. Sevoreth was quiet for a moment. 10,000 years, he said. Give or take, I said. The specific tactical encoding system I built is mine. I developed it over 12 years of operational use, and it gets refined every deployment. But the underlying auditory mechanism it exploits is very old, probably as old as organized human conflict. He relayed this. I know Dashvaratha's response in some detail because Sevoreth described it to me afterward with accuracy I appreciated. Dashvarathi had laughed. Not dismissively, not cruelly, genuinely amused. He had told his command staff that it was the most creative rationalization for a primitive coordination system he had encountered in 40 years of training operations, that the construction was exactly the kind of narrative a species, without a proper signals doctrine, would produce to explain why their communications were archaic, that he respected the storytelling, even if he placed the actual operational utility of singing soldiers at approximately zero. He said the word zero with an inflection that, as Sevoreth rendered it in English, meant something closer to negative actually. He then directed Velthrasa to run a full analysis of the human musical traffic. His reasoning, as Sevoreth described it, was that any analytical exercise was useful training even when the subject matter was operationally irrelevant, that looking for structured signal in what was essentially human ambient noise would sharpen his team's attention to low signal strength anomalies, and that at a minimum they would produce a clean documentation of why the system didn't work, which could be useful as a teaching example. Velthrasa's team spent 8 hours on it. At the end of 8 hours, her senior signals analyst, a veteran officer with 32 years of intercept experience, and, as his file apparently noted, a particular specialty in non-standard signal modalities, filed a report. The report stated that the human vocal and instrumental production contained no extractable tactical data by any known signal analysis methodology, that the patterns were consistent with random emotional vocalization and cultural background expression, that the apparent structural regularity in the rhythmic elements was most likely apophenia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful pattern in random acoustic stimuli, which was known to affect analysts who had been listening to a specific sound source for extended periods, that the recommendation was to log the traffic as ambient and proceed with standard analysis of declared channels. Dashvarathi shared this report with his full command staff. There were, by Sevoreth's account, several minutes of sustained amusement in the command center. I was not present for those several minutes. I was in the equipment pit, running the Day 3 preparation, but I had a reasonable idea of the general register of the conversation, because it was not the first time I had been on the receiving end of that conversation. My own formation had said a version of it to me when I first developed the system. The Vreth Combine's intelligence section had said a version of it in a captured report from the Callan Station engagement. A Halun Sovereignty Liaison officer had said a version of it at a multi-species tactical conference 3 years ago, politely enough that I hadn't felt obligated to respond. The Keth-Tavrosi version was not especially original, but it was said with somewhat more institutional confidence than the others, and it was backed by a signals analysis apparatus that was, by any honest assessment, better than any that had previously looked at the system. Velthrosa had looked at the system and found nothing. That was, from a professional standpoint, the best result I had ever gotten. While all of this was happening, the relay, the amused meeting, the A-Tower analysis that produced a report about apophenia, we were running the actual Day 2 operation, which required my attention more than my feelings about anyone's intelligence assessment did. The advance on Installation 7 went cleanly. 2nd Battalion took its objective in 4 hours, which was within the expected window. 1st Battalion, operating further east in the Basalt Canyon country, had a tighter approach. The terrain forced a 2-column advance that compressed their communication geometry and required careful timing on the integration point. I ran that timing through the acoustic channel with a tempo modulation that, from the Keth-Tavrosi intercept station, sounded like Sergeant Yebo humming to himself while he worked, which was because it was Sergeant Yebo humming to himself while he worked. The integration went correctly. The 2 columns merged at the objective point within a 90-second window of each other. In the afternoon, I let the flanking gap happen. This requires a brief explanation. Our declared communications coverage had a notional weak point in the northeast sector of the Installation 6 approach corridor. It was weak because I had designed it to be weak, not dramatically, not in a way that would look like a trap, but weak enough that a skilled adversary doing a signals analysis would identify it as the most efficient exploitation avenue if they wanted to commit a flanking element. Doshvarath's signals section found it at 1340. His ground element commander committed a flanking force to that sector at 1420. They interdicted Installation 6 at 1611 in a textbook approach. I watched it happen on my boards and did nothing to prevent it. One of my specialists, Corporal Adisa, who was 26 and had been running signals for 3 years and was very good at her job, looked at me when the installation fell and waited for me to say something. "Log it," I said. "Chief," she said. "Log it," I said again. She logged it. Day 2 ended with Red having achieved 2 clean installations. They had interdicted Relay 6 through the flanking approach I had opened for them, and they had neutralized one of our ground companies in a fire-for-effect simulation that was textbook Keth-Tavrosi doctrine. Identify through signals intercept, fix with suppression, apply effect. Clean. Professional. The kind of outcome that 11 consecutive exercise victories produces in a formation, not arrogance, just a well-grooved competence. What the Day 2 after-action picture did not show, because it was not visible in any system they were running, was that the flanking element they had committed to exploit the Installation 6 gap had now moved into exactly the sector I needed them in for Day 3. They were good soldiers doing exactly what good soldiers do when they find an opening. I had given them the opening. By their analysis, going into Day 3, they held 2 installations. We held 3. Their ship element had our ship formation in a tightening positional envelope. Their ground element was advancing on our remaining installations with a compression approach that, by their signals picture, would have us route compromised by Day 3 evening. By their signals picture, they understood approximately 40% of our coordination architecture. 10% of that was partially decoded. They had real-time intercept coverage across something like 70% of our declared communications volume. What they did not have, anywhere in that picture, was the other picture, the one running underneath, the one that had been running for 2 full days without appearing anywhere in their analysis except as a footnote in a report about apophenia. Day 3 is the part of this story I return to most often, so I am going to take some time with it. At 700, before the day's operations began, I made 2 adjustments. The first was a change to the encoding key. Every formation unit received it through the audio channel, in the form of a specific sequence in the morning coordination routine that the Keth-Tavrossi monitoring systems recorded as ambient sound. What it said, to the people in the formation who had been running this system for weeks and had the key in their muscle memory, was, "New key in effect as of 7:30, here are the new parameters. New directional encoding scale. Inverted tempo-threat relationship. What had meant contact now meant hold, and what had meant hold now meant execute. New harmonic integrity markers, and a new rhythmic beat pattern that I had never used in any previous operation, which meant exactly one thing: full commitment, all elements simultaneous." The key change took 4 minutes to propagate through all units. None of it went through a frequency Velthrossa was monitoring. None of it appeared in any signal log. By 7:31, every unit in the formation, from the ship element, 62,000 kilometers out to the ground companies on the equatorial belt, had received a complete update to the coordination protocol, and the signal picture the Keth-Tavrossi were watching showed nothing unusual had happened. The second adjustment was a deliberate increase in our declared channel traffic. I had Corporal Bikel generate a standard set of coordination messages on the declared architecture: movement requests, status reports, logistics queries, exactly the kind of traffic a formation in our position would be producing if it was beginning to feel the pressure of the compression approach. It was not fabricated. Every message corresponded to something real, but it was weighted to produce a picture consistent with a formation that was relying on its declared channels, that was under pressure, and that was about to respond to that pressure in predictable ways. Velthrossa's team intercepted all of it. They decoded roughly 30% of it in real time, which was the correct fraction for a team of their capability looking at a 40% mapped channel architecture. By 900, Red had committed their jamming element forward. Dashvarathi had made this decision based on the Day 2 picture and the Day 3 declared traffic, which together told him that we were dependent on our declared channels and that interdicting them would effectively blind us at the operational level. It was the correct decision given his information. His jamming element was positioned to achieve coverage across all our declared channels within a 6-minute window. At 8:47, I changed the tempo. The tempo change told the formation, execute. It propagated in 3 minutes. By 8:50, every unit had it. By 8:51, the formation was in motion, executing the repositioning I had been preparing for 2 days. A coordinated movement by all 4 ships and both ground battalions to positions that Red's compression model had assigned low occupancy probability. Because Red's compression model was built on a signals picture that showed a formation under pressure and reacting, not a formation that had been building toward a specific outcome since the exercise began. At 9:17, Red's jamming element achieved full coverage of our declared communications. Every declared channel went dark in a clean, professional, comprehensive interdiction. From their perspective, they had just cut the main nervous system of our formation. From Velthrossa's intercept station, the declared channel traffic dropped to 0. The picture went quiet. I watched it come up on my boards and poured coffee into my thermos cap. The acoustic layer did not notice the jamming. The jamming equipment was very good at suppressing M signal and had no effect whatsoever on the sound a human being makes when they are doing their job. By 9:30, our formation was in the new positions. Red's model of our formation was 13 minutes out of date and growing less accurate by the second, because every update it needed to correct itself was coming in through the declared channels, which were down. At 9:47, I sent the execute signal for the flanking element I had positioned the previous night. The one that had moved into the sector I'd opened on day 2 by leaving a gap in declared coverage that Dashvaratha's ground element had, exactly as I'd expected, moved into to exploit. Velthrasa, I learned afterward, spent 90 minutes reviewing her intercept logs before she filed an anomaly report. The report said, "Human formation has executed complex tactical repositioning with zero intercept signature across declared and undeclared channels, reviewing for sensor fault." There was no sensor fault. At 10:45, Dashvarathi received a series of reports from his ground element commanders that were, collectively, inconsistent with the tactical picture he had been operating on. Units that should have been advancing on a fixed defensive position were instead encountering a formation that was not where his model said it was. His flanking element, committed to the sector that was supposed to be the weak point of our defensive posture, was reporting contact with 2 human ground companies, approaching from directions his formation model did not account for. He called for a signals update. Velthrasa's update was, declared channels remain suppressed, no coordination traffic detected, formation movement is occurring without detectable coordination signal. Dashvarathi looked at this update and said a word that Sevoreth declined to translate for me, citing that it was a fairly specialized piece of Kethavrosi military profanity with no exact English equivalent, though he was willing to confirm that it described a state of affairs that was regarded as operationally unfortunate. He then said, "Find the channel." His signals section, 8 experienced analysts, the best the 3rd Expeditionary Cadre had in the field, spent 4 hours looking for the channel. They did not find it. They could not find it. The channel was not on any frequency in their analysis range because the channel was not a signal in any definition their analysis systems were designed to detect. The channel was Sergeant Alabi's second-in-command singing a low call-and response with the lead vehicle crew during a ground advance, and it sounded exactly like the ambient noise profile of a human signals formation on a cold basalt plain. And every algorithm Velthrasa's team had available was producing the same result it had produced on day 2. Ambient, non-signal, operationally irrelevant. At 13:12, Red's flanking element, caught between our 2 advancing ground companies in a sector their formation model said was supposed to be our weak point, was declared in simulated route compromise. 40% of Red's ground combat power gone. At 14:47, one of our ship elements executed a burn into the gap that Red's jamming run had opened in their own formation. It was a narrow gap. The jamming element's repositioning to achieve coverage had created a brief positional vulnerability that would have been meaningless to a formation that couldn't coordinate without its declared channels. We could coordinate without our declared channels. We used the gap. At 16:03, the second of our ground companies retook Installation 6, the one they had lost on day 2, the one I had let them take in order to pull their flanking element into position. The retake took 9 minutes. The Kethavrosi flanking element that had been holding the installation found itself in a position that their formation model had not predicted was possible, because their formation model was running on data that was by now 2 hours stale and growing less accurate by the minute. They responded correctly given the information they had. The information they had was wrong, and nothing in Velthrasa's intercept picture was updating it, because the updates were coming through a channel her systems were still logging as ambient. I watched the installation change hands on the board and poured the last of the thermos coffee. It was cold. It was still better than the cedar version, which was saying something modest. Corporal Adisa looked at me. "Now," she said. "In about 40 minutes, I said. She went back to her board. The board showed a picture that looked, from the outside, like a formation in the final stages of losing an exercise. 3 installations held, 2 in red hands, communications dark ship formation in a defensive envelope that was tightening. From inside the formation, the picture was different. The picture from inside was of a formation that had been building toward a specific moment since day one, and the moment was approximately 40 minutes out. At 1638, our ship elements burn completed. The gap that Red's jamming run had opened in their own formation, the positional gap created when they repositioned their jamming equipment for full declare channel coverage, had been there for 49 minutes. In a formation that couldn't coordinate without its declared channels, 49 minutes was not enough to identify and exploit a positional gap. In a formation that could coordinate without its declared channels, 49 minutes was more than adequate. The ship element's positioning was confirmed through the acoustic channel at 1641. No M signal, no transmission. The confirmation was a specific harmonic shift in the coordination channel that meant position achieved and holding, and it came through in the ambient audio of the tactical radio, net the way all the rest of the acoustic traffic came through, which was to say, invisibly. At 1748, Dashvarathi called the exercise. I was in the equipment pit when the call came through, running a post-operation signals review, and the first indication I had was Corporal Bikel looking up from her board and saying, in the flat tone she used for significant events, "They've called it, Chief." "Good," I said, and finished the review. The silence that follows a result that was not supposed to happen has a specific quality that is different from ordinary silence. I have been present at the creation of that silence more than once in my career, and I find it more informative than most of what gets said in the room afterward. It tells you something about the depth of the assumption that was just violated. The Keth-Davrosi version was quieter than most. I was called to the command center at 1900. Sevorath met me at the entry with the particular expression of someone who has witnessed something and is still arranging it into a coherent order. "Chief Oshino," he said. "Sevorath," I said. "The senior fleet claw would like to speak with you." Dashvarathi was at the analysis table when I entered. Standing with the stillness that I had come to understand was his default mode for extended thinking, not rigid, but entirely unhurried, the kind of stillness that comes from having a very quiet relationship with urgency. The tactical display was still up. The final positions, the compromised elements, the ship gap, the 3 remaining installations in Blue's hands. He did not look up when I entered. He looked up after I had crossed to the table, and the regard that came with the 4-point eye contact was the specific quality that meant full attention rather than courtesy. "Chief Warrant Officer Oshino," he said. His translator's rendering of his voice was measured, precise, without heat. "Senior Fleet Claw," I said. "Your formation executed a coordinated repositioning at 900 that my signals section did not intercept," he said. "You executed a second coordinated action at 947 and a third at 1447 after my jamming element had achieved full coverage of your declared communications architecture. All 3 actions demonstrated multi-unit precision consistent with real-time command and control. My senior signals analyst, who has 32 years of intercept experience and who has specifically reviewed your full acoustic traffic record, has provided an assessment that she characterizes as incomplete." "Okay," I said. There was a pause. Dashvarathi looked at the display for a moment. "You will explain it," he said. "Yes," I said. "The uncharacterized signal traffic from the first evening's sweep. Your analyst's report characterized it as ambient noise and probable apophenia." "She was correct that it was not detectable as a signal," he said. "She was not correct about what it was." "No," I said. "It was the coordination channel, the parallel layer, the music." He was quiet for a moment. "Explain the architecture," he said. I explained it. The full version, key structure and positional encoding, tempo movement correlation, harmonic formation state reporting, rhythm pattern threat vector mapping, melodic variation as commander's intent channel. The acoustic transmission medium, The reason it was unjammable by conventional M warfare systems. The reason it was invisible to standard signal analysis. The encoding key's distribution through cultural practice rather than document, which meant it could not be captured, extracted, copied, or compromised through signals intelligence. Dashvarathi listened to all of this without interrupting once. He had the listening quality of a very experienced commander who knows that the purpose of listening is information, not validation. When I finished, he said, "The transmission medium is acoustic. It rides in the ambient sound environment of the formation. Yes, it cannot be jammed. Not with standard electronic warfare. Full acoustic suppression, not jamming the medium, but eliminating the propagation environment entirely, would work in theory. In practice, full acoustic suppression of a dispersed formation is significantly harder than standard jamming, requires much heavier equipment, and produces a detection signature large enough to give us advance warning. You have thought about this for some time." 12 years, I said. He was quiet for long enough that I had time to notice how still the command center had become. His staff officers were at their stations, not looking at us, which was the specific posture of professionals who are very carefully not listening. Then he said, "You ran a complete parallel command and control system through human singing." "And percussion," I said. "One of Sergeant Alabi's people maintains the timing channel on a frame drum. His grandfather brought it from Nigeria. It's approximately 60 years old. A beat. And this drum," he said, "was present throughout the exercise. It was in the equipment pit with me on day 2 and day 3. Yes. Specialist Amoko had it. He used it during the installation advance on the second morning and during the Chi change propagation sequence on day 3. My analysts listened to the audio from that equipment pit," he said, "for 8 hours. "I know," I said. He looked at the display again, at the gap, at the compromised ground element, at the retaken installation. "The analysis report," he said, with the careful neutrality of someone reviewing a professional judgment. "Filed by my signals section. It stated that your vocal production contained no extractable tactical data. The analyst described the apparent structure as apophenia. That is the correct outcome of applying your analysis methodology to the signal," I said. "Your methodology looks for structure in the electromagnetic domain. The structure in our coordination system is in the acoustic domain, encoded in musical forms that are not in your analysis library, because there has never been a reason for them to be. Until now." He turned to look at me, all 4 eyes the full regard. "Our intelligence file on your species," he said, "states that your communication architecture is dependent on standard M signal modalities with minimal innovation since initial technology adoption." "I read the file," I said. "It requires revision," he said, with the tone of someone making a precise technical note. "I appreciate that," I said. Another silence shorter than the previous one. Then he said, "Velthrasa." She stepped forward from where she had been standing at the edge of the room. Her expression was the particular professional composure that I had come to read as focused absorption. She had been processing this, and the processing had reached a stage. "Senior Fleetclaw. Your assessment." Velthrasa looked at me for a moment, then at Dashvarathi. "The system is effective," she said. "The acoustic coordination channel is effectively unjammable with conventional electronic warfare systems. The key distribution problem, which is the central vulnerability of any encoding system, is solved by cultural transmission. The key is not a document. It cannot be captured, copied, extracted by signals intelligence, or compromised by a source inside the formation who lacks the specific cultural framework to reproduce it. The channel capacity is lower than digital communications, but for command-level coordination in a dispersed operation, the data rate appears adequate." She paused. "I want to examine the encoding architecture in detail. I have questions about the harmonic integrity channel specifically. Talk to my people, I said. I can arrange it. Yes, she said, and looked at me in the way she had on the first morning, but with the contents of that look substantially revised. I think I should have arranged it earlier. The debrief ran 2 full days. Velthrasa and I spent most of both days in a small analysis room with a whiteboard that had been provisioned for the exercise, a shared supply of the cedar coffee, and a growing density of notes. She worked the way I expected from everything I had seen, systematically, from first principles, asking exactly the question that needed to be asked before moving to the next one. She understood the architecture faster than anyone outside my formation ever had. By the second hour, she had the key structure mapped in enough detail to be asking about edge cases I had worked through years ago. By the end of the first day, she was identifying inefficiencies I had been too close to the system to see clearly. Places where the harmonic channel was carrying redundant data. Places where the tempo encoding had a timing ambiguity at the boundary between 2 states. Places where the melodic variation range was broad enough to create interpretation errors under high cognitive load. She pointed all of these out with the brisk, unself-conscious clarity of someone who does signals optimization as naturally as breathing and cannot help applying it to whatever system is in front of her. I took notes. Her notes were, as I told her at the end of the second day, better than mine. On the morning of the last day, sitting across from me with a cup of the cedar coffee and a tablet covered in her handwriting, she said, "The system has a vulnerability." "Several," I said. "The acoustic propagation medium," she said. "In a dispersed formation, your acoustic coordination channel requires relay. The signal passes through the audio of the radio channels, which means the radio channels must be live. Jamming cannot suppress the acoustic layer, but taking the channels entirely off the air, eliminating the propagation medium, not blocking the M signal, would in theory collapse the acoustic layer." "Yes," I said. "Full suppression rather than jamming. It requires substantially more resources and more time than jamming. And it produces a detection signature we would see 40 minutes out at standard approach speed," I said, "which gives us time to switch propagation medium. We can run the acoustic layer through any audio channel, tactical radio, equipment intercoms, even external speakers. Suppressing all of them simultaneously in a dispersed formation is not a realistic attack." She considered this, made a note. "You have iterated this system extensively." "Every deployment," I said, "it gets a little better each time." She looked at her notes for a moment. "I want to include this in the post-exercise report with recommendations for study," she said. "There may be aspects of the architecture that have applicability to Keth-Tavrossi doctrine." She paused and looked up. "We have our own acoustic communication traditions. Military drum communication in particular, several species, we have historically engaged use similar systems. We studied them in order to counter them. We never considered developing our own equivalent because we assumed that electronic signal architecture had made acoustic methods obsolete." "Maybe it didn't make them obsolete," I said. "Maybe it just made them optional. You use both and you pick based on what the environment calls for." She looked at me with the 4-point convergence she used for careful thinking. Then she said, "Yes, I believe that is the correct framing. I will recommend a study program along those lines." She did. I read the report 3 months later, when an administrative clerk in the Joint Operations Liaison Office accidentally included it in the wrong shared document package. A thing that seemed to happen with some frequency in combined human Keth-Tavrossi operations, and which I had gradually come to regard as either a persistent administrative flaw or a somewhat deniable form of professional courtesy. The report was thorough. It described the system accurately, identified the vulnerabilities correctly, and recommended an integration study that would, if the Defense Collective's procurement process ran at its standard speed, produce a doctrine revision in roughly 4 years. There was a note at the end, in Velthross's hand, that I found worth keeping. It said, "Note for future intelligence assessments. Human signal architecture should not be evaluated solely against standard M signal analysis methodology. Human auditory coordination capacity is anomalously high relative to most known species. Their communication systems may exploit acoustic and pattern recognition mechanisms that do not present on standard spectrum analysis. Recommend updating collection methodology accordingly." Underneath that, in smaller writing, "The drum is approximately 60 years old. The encoding tradition it carries is approximately 10,000. We should have looked for the songs." Sevoreth walked me to the transport on the last morning. He was carrying 2 of my equipment cases, because he had offered and I had let him, and he had the settled expression of someone who had made several significant revisions to their working model of the world over the past 4 days, and was feeling reasonably good about where they had landed. "Chief Oceano," he said when we reached the pad, "I want to apologize." "For what?" "For the translation I gave you on the 3rd morning," he said. "The phrase I rendered as the noise animals make before they die. I should have provided more context." "The context being?" He hesitated for a moment in the way of someone choosing between a short version and an accurate one. "The phrase is old. It comes from a period in Keth-Tavrosi history, very old history, before recorded doctrine, when our military was engaged in a long conflict with a neighboring species we understood poorly. Our commanders used that phrase to describe the sounds those soldiers made before they committed to an engagement. The sounds were analyzed. Our analysts found no signal in them and concluded there was no signal. Their report was definitive. It was filed and relied upon." He paused. "There was a signal," he said. "Our analysts simply could not read it." I looked at him. "How long did that conflict run?" 30 years, the second phase of it," he said. "After the analyst's report was accepted as doctrine, we eventually identified the communication system. It was acoustic, though different in structure from yours. We won the conflict, ultimately, but the 30-year second phase is now studied as a doctrinal example of what happens when you accept a negative finding as absolute." He was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother was a military historian. She told me the story when I was young, as a lesson. She described it as the importance of looking for the file you don't have." "Smart woman," I said. "She would have found your system interesting," he said. "I think she would have appreciated it more than she would have liked to admit." He said it with the slight warmth of someone referencing a person they had loved and missed, and I chose not to make anything of that, because the moment didn't call for it. The transport lifted at 800. I watched the Keth-Tavrosi base get small below me, the neat geometric arrangement of their prefab structures, the equipment staging areas, the landing pads, the whole careful organization of a military formation that had been doing this for 1,000 years and had built the infrastructure to show for it. And I thought about Sevoreth's grandmother and her lesson about the file you don't have. About Dashvarath's note to himself, quiet, precise, without self-pity, that they should have found the songs. About Velthross's report and the recommendation to update collection methodology, which was the language a good signals officer uses when they mean, "We were looking in the wrong place, and here is the right place, and we will not make this error again." Sergeant Alabi's drum was in a padded case in the equipment bay below me. 60 years old, give or take, scarred from a dozen deployments. His grandfather had played it at community gatherings, at celebrations, at the kind of events where music does the work that speech alone cannot do, holds people together, coordinates movement, makes a group of individuals into something that breathes with one rhythm. The tactical encoding was mine. The drum was older than me by most of a lifetime, and the tradition it carried was older than either of us by a span of time that made the difference between us irrelevant. I pulled out the debrief notes and Velthross's markup and started working through the inefficiencies she had identified. If she was going to produce a study program based on the system, the least I could do was make sure the system she was studying was as good as I could make it. The cedar coffee she had pressed on me as a parting gift sat in the cup holder to my left. I had developed, over 4 days, a genuine appreciation for it that I was not entirely ready to admit. It still smelled like burned cedar, but it was honest about what it was and it worked.